In March of 1966, John Lennon did a harmless interview with friend of the band and journalist Maureen Cleave. In this interview, he happened to drop the fact that he felt the Beatles were bigger than Jesus Christ. No harm done, right? So why did this interview threaten to cancel the Beatles as we know it? How did John Lennon and the rest of the band react to this public outcry? And did this incident lead to the decision for the Beatles to stop touring altogether and focus on producing some of the greatest albums of all time? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because we're all about deep dives into music history. Let's dive in. In March of 1966, the London Evening Standard published a series of deep dive interviews with the Beatles. Maureen Cleave was a friend of the band and someone they felt they could trust, as she was a similar age, something unlike other members of the press and other journalists like that at that time. In this interview, Lennon says this: "Christianity will go," he said. "It will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue about that. I'm right and I will be proved right. We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which one will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. Jesus was alright, but his disciples were thick and ordinary. It's them twisting it that ruins it for me." She also adds in the interview that John had been reading extensively about religion at that time. So the article went out without any fanfare, just another interview with the Beatles. It was actually even picked up by the San Francisco Chronicle on April the 13th. However, as expected, it went nowhere. Nobody cared about his comments. Nobody cared about what a rock star had to say about matters like politics and religion. And this also included the times that John would talk about the government in the mid-60s, which would actually foreshadow a lot of his activism that would be a huge part of his life in the 1970s. However, after a disastrous few months in Japan and the Philippines, and don't get me wrong, I will do a video about these days, Brian Epstein got a call from Wendy Hansen, an employee of his company in London, about a story circulating in a cheesy American magazine called Datebook about some comments that John had made about Christianity. She warned Brian that you better get on top of this. Nat Weiss, an attorney of many rock stars and an associate of the Beatles, then rang Brian to tell him that in Birmingham, Alabama, a place firmly in the Bible Belt, they were burning Beatles records. The magazine Datebook was well renowned for trying to stir up controversy, and John Lennon's comments about Jesus weren't even the headline of the magazine. I can't say it on here for obvious reasons, but the headline was actually a quote from Paul about segregation in the South, and the front cover was a picture of him. But however, it's John's words that got all the attention. Bible-thumping disc jockeys banned Beatles records all over the country and sponsored community bonfires. Once the story was picked up, boycotts began spreading in other communities too. So the Beatles at first joked that in order to burn their albums, you first had to buy them. It's no sweat off us, mate. Burn them if you like. KZEE in Weatherford, Texas damned their songs eternally. KCBN in Reno broadcasted an anti-Beatles editorial every hour, and WAYX in Waycross, Georgia burned its entire stock of Beatles records. A Baptist minister in Cleveland threatened to revoke the membership of any member who played Beatles records. And the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan in Carolina nailed several Beatles albums to a cross and set it aflame. How crazy is all this?
This is Tommy Charles. If you, as an American teenager, are offended by statements from a group of foreign singers which strike at the very basis of our existence as God-fearing, patriotic citizens, then we urge you to take your Beatle records, pictures, and souvenirs to the picture.
To be honest, for me, the craziest part is the kind of reaction. So today, we obviously have cancel culture, but to have sparked such a visceral reaction due to just very minor comments about religion is almost completely unlike anything today. So the Beatles' press officer Tony Barrow said, "We were told that religious zealots were threatening to assassinate John if he came to Memphis." And Memphis was actually going to be a scheduled stop on their upcoming tour. Paul later said it took a little bit of time for the Beatles to take it all very seriously. Brian actually called it a storm in a teacup, though whether he was being completely truthful about how he felt is still debated, as pretty soon afterwards he called for a trip to America to sort things out. At a place in Broadway in New York, Brian rang Damage Control. He called the comments taken out of context. He argued that people were thinking John was saying we are more important than Jesus, as opposed to more popular. Maureen Cleave also went on a small string of interviews, and this is very unusual for a journalist to do this, just to clarify her comments. He was observing that because of the weak state of Christianity at the moment, the Beatles are better known, she said. George said the radio stations in the South were having a field day. Well, this is just fantastic for him. It's just easy press across the whole country. One of the things I would love to know is just how many people felt truly offended by John's comments. If you were there, or anyone you know was there or around at that time, I'd love you to comment down below, just so I can get like a full picture of what went on at that time. John had forgotten about the comments he'd made to Maureen until they all surfaced up in August, several months later. Tell them to get stuffed, he said, when asked if he was going to apologise. I've got nothing to apologise for. He even said he'd rather cancel the tour than get up on stage and lie through an apology. Despite his reluctance, Brian made John relent. They both came up with a statement together, but it would be Brian who would say it, not John. Brian booked a suite in the Americana Hotel in New York and summoned a press conference. And he then said,
"Thank you. Now, the only reason why I am here, actually, is in an attempt, to clarify the situation, the general furore which has arisen here. And I have prepared a statement which I will read, which has had John Lennon's absolute approval this afternoon with myself by telephone. The quote which John Lennon made to a London columnist more than 3 months ago has been quoted and represented entirely out of context. Lennon is deeply interested in religion and was at the time having serious talks with Maureen Cleave, who is both a friend of the Beatles and a representative for the London Evening Standard. The talks were concerning religion. What he said and meant was that he was astonished that in the last 50 years, the Church in England, and therefore Christ, had suffered a decline in interest. He did not mean to boast about the Beatles' fame. He meant to point out that the Beatles' effect appeared to be, to him, a more immediate one upon certainly the younger generation.
As you guessed, it didn't quite do the trick. John was adamant that he wasn't going to apologise. So Brian, who was the father figure of the group, he wouldn't hear of it. He couldn't let this ruin several things that were cooking at that time for the Beatles. The Beatles were in the middle of negotiating a new record deal with EMI and Capitol. The riches of this new deal would be unprecedented compared to what they'd signed on for before. Brian insisted that John had to think about Paul, George and Ringo. So on August the 11th, on the eve of the 1966 America tour, John Lennon had to face the press in Astor Towers in Chicago. 3 major television networks had set up cameras in the corridor and were waiting. John was very nervous backstage. Fearing that John was about to back down, Brian insisted that he was truly scared someone may try and assassinate the Beatles during the tour. The threats had been numerous. At that point, John broke down into tears and said he'll do whatever he had to do and that he didn't mean to truly cause all of this. And John really was a wreck at this point. The frenzy and the fear, and most likely too the relentlessness of touring and Beatlemania was truly breaking him.
If it had said television is more popular than Jesus, I might have got away with it. I happened to be talking to a friend. I used the word Beatles as a remote thing, not as what I think, as Beatles as though those other Beatles like other people see us. And I just said they are having more influence on kids and things than anything else, including Jesus. But I said it in that way, which is the wrong way. Yap, yap. I wasn't knocking it or putting it down. I was just saying it as a fact. And it is true, especially more for England than here. You know, but I'm not saying that we're better or greater or comparing us with Jesus Christ as a person or God as a thing or whatever it is. You know, I just said what I said and it was wrong or was taken wrong.
John tried his best to make reporters understand why he'd said what he'd said. They just wanted to make a celebrity look like a fool in front of the entire country. After John eventually apologised, a reporter shouted out, "Can you say how actually sorry you are to the camera?" And upon hearing this, the Beatles understood everything. Nobody cared about it or what John had said, and it was all just for show. The press was quite prepared, actually, to let the Lennon affair die to preserve the spirit of Beatlemania. Why would they want to destroy the 4 people that were responsible for endless stories for them? To some degree, this event did deeply impact their tour. In Memphis, there was a real serious feeling within the group. They were different to their jovial, joking selves. They were all nervous about Memphis in particular, as this had been where the assassination threat had come from. Brian was still convinced some nutjob was going to try and shoot John. They'd spoken about the idea of cancelling the Memphis gig, but they all agreed, and Paul later said, if you cancel one, just cancel them all. When they land in Memphis, only George could see the humour in the situation. Send John out first, he said. He's the one they want. That show was just like any other. By the second show, the Beatles were more relaxed and elated. The arena was even busier the second night too. But it was during the third song, If I Needed Someone, when a shot rang out. The Beatles all panicked on stage. Tony Barrow and Brian Epstein jumped into each other. Paul and George looked straight for John, whom they feared the worst for. However, it had just been 2 teenagers that had thrown a cherry bomb onto the stage. So I want to do a whole deeper video into the American tour of 1966, the few times that the Beatles actually ever did play live. So I don't want to get any more into it on this particular video. I just want to mention that this experience was a huge part of John saying that he didn't want to tour anymore. He actually said, I don't want to tour again, especially after having been accused of crucifying Jesus and having to stand with the Klan outside and firecrackers going on inside. I just couldn't take it anymore. So Lennon's bigger than Jesus line hit a nerve in 1966, sparking boycotts and bonfires. It wasn't a claim of divinity, it was just a mirror to a changing society. The uproar proved faith and fame don't mix easy. And today, it's a footnote that still stings. But what's your take? Do you think he was treated unfairly? How do you feel like he reacted to it? Leave it all down below in the comments. At the Rock and Roll Archives, I'm all about educating everyone on the beautiful history and stories about some of the best songs ever written. So please don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join me next time for more stories about the crazy world of rock and roll. See you next time.